I'd love to get a psychologist's definition of vulnerability.
Yeah. So I've been watching your podcast for a minute, and I love that vulnerability is what you've honed in on. So vulnerability to me is really being true to yourself, and it's being secure with yourself, really. And so when I think about vulnerability, I think about something that I learned it really in grad school through my experience of treating people with therapy. And one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of people are insecure. And what I mean by that is a lot of people at some point in their life, they've developed this belief that they're just not good enough, that there's something wrong with them,
Right.
that there's something that makes them not worthy of whatever they have. And so they learned early on that it's not okay to not be good enough. And I think that's because we as human beings, we are wired first to assign ourselves to a group. We have to have a tribe, right? We're social creatures. And then once we get in that group, we like volley to be at the top of the group because, you can pull out evolutionary explanations for that. Like the more alpha in groups are the ones that are more likely to procreate and survive and all that. And so when we find ourselves not at the top of our group and maybe at the bottom, when we think that we're inadequate, that's not good. And so we find ways to like never let anybody know that we're not good enough. And that's where the insecurity, that like I'm never going to show weakness. I'm going to keep my gloves up at all time.
Right. Welcome to the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. I'm your host, Yuma Barnett. You guys are all very familiar with me. And today my guest is Jeremy Noble. He is somebody that I avoided for about 18 years while I was in the 75th Ranger Regiment because he's a licensed psychologist, Army veteran, and not only a licensed psychologist, but formerly the RPSych, the regiment of the 75th Ranger Regiment psychologist, which is a pretty big deal. It's even a bigger deal if you're a senior NCO like I am, and many of you listening who avoided his office for a number of years to try to not face some of those things that we did over the years and while we're deployed. But it's an honor to have him here today. I could talk for a while about Jeremy, but I think it would be better coming from him. I'll turn it over to him so he can introduce himself, and we'll take the conversation from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Yuma. Thanks for having me. So a little bit about me, about my background. So I have a PhD in counseling psychology, which really means that I was trained to treat and diagnose mental disorders or psychological issues. And so the first part of my career was really sitting in a therapy room and treating folks. I joined the Army right out of grad school, and immediately started doing clinical work, with the Army with soldiers. Pretty quickly moved over into the special operations community, thanks to a former RPSych named Art Finch.
Yes.
Who he was a faculty member of mine when I was a resident in my postdoc. And he came up to me one day and said, "Hey, I think you'd make a good Ranger Psych." And I said, "What's that?" and so the next thing I know, he connected me with Xavier Pena, who was the RPSych at the time. And Xavier brought me out to RASP 2, and I assessed. I don't know why they selected me. I would not have selected me at the time, but became the RPSych. That was in 2015, and went to Ranger School. Took the long route in Ranger School. It took me like 120 days to get through it. And so I assumed the role as the RPSych in 2016 and was there for about 5.5 years, so till 2021. And then I went up to DC, went to another USASOC unit up there for about 1.5 years, and then decided to leave the Army. And since I started my own consulting business, so I do organizational psychology now. I got board certified in organizational and business consulting psychology. So my time in the Army was really more like organizational psychology, like I did a lot of, like with RASP, we did personnel selection, a lot of command consultation, leader development. And so that's what I do now on the civilian side.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think you're not alone in that fact that, I've been through RASP 3 or 4 times, and I wondered every time when I was done after walking out of that boardroom, I go, there's no way I'm getting selected to come back here again. So I think we've all felt that. And I think the best way to start off this, before we delve deeper into some of what you said there, is I'd love to get a psychologist's definition of vulnerability.
Yeah. So I've been watching your podcast for a minute, and I love that vulnerability is what you've honed in on. So vulnerability to me is really being true to yourself, and it's being secure with yourself, really. And so when I think about vulnerability, I think about something that I learned it really in grad school through my experience of treating people with therapy. And one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of people are insecure. And what I mean by that is a lot of people at some point in their life, they've developed this belief that they're just not good enough, that there's something wrong with them,
Right.
that there's something that makes them not worthy of whatever they have. And so they learned early on that it's not okay to not be good enough. And I think that's because we as human beings, we are wired first to assign ourselves to a group. We have to have a tribe, right? We're
Yep.
social creatures. And then once we get in that group, we like volley to be at the top of the group because you can pull out evolutionary explanations for that. Like the more alpha in groups are the ones that are more likely to procreate and survive and all that. And so when we find ourselves not at the top of our group and maybe at the bottom, when we think that we're inadequate, that's not good. And
Right.
so we find ways to like never let anybody know that we're not good enough. And that's where the insecurity that like I'm never going to show weakness. I'm going to keep my gloves up at all time.
Right.
And I had a colleague when I was at Bolick, actually, my roommate at Basic Officer Leadership course, another psychologist named Paul Danon, who said something that resonated with me once. He said vulnerability is strength, and it took me a minute to really understand what he was talking about. But I think of it as like a boxer. So a boxer is going to keep his gloves up because he's got to protect himself, right? But if a boxer were to just drop his gloves and let somebody hit him and be okay with that and know that there's no haymaker that guy can throw that's going to hurt me, like that's about as strong as it gets.
Right.
And so when Paul said that vulnerability is strength, that sort of made me rethink or sort of recalibrate my thoughts around that. And because I mean, if you are vulnerable with somebody and you just kind of let it all out there, you're secure with yourself.
Right.
And so long-winded response to say that's kind of what I
Yeah.
think of when I think of vulnerability.
Yeah, you say a long-winded response, but I'm firm. It's not simple, right? It's not as simple as vulnerability is not showing weakness, or it's detailed, and I think it might be a little bit unique to every person and their personal story and their background and what
Totally.
vulnerability means to them. But I love the definition. And I just want to, I went to a recruiting station when I was, 16 years old. I said, I'm either going to play college basketball or I'm going to join the Army. And when I thought about joining the Army, it was infantry, infantry, infantry. That's all I wanted to do.
Yeah.
It never crossed my mind to be a psychologist, right? So what drew you into that field, psychology
Yeah.
in general?
Yeah.
And then and then military psychology on top of that, what piqued that interest in you?
Yeah. Yeah, so I took a psychology class in high school, my senior year of high school, and had a great teacher, and that got me excited about psychology, and I've always been fascinated with human behavior of like what makes people do what they do, and so I decided to major in that in college, and then I'm just sort of floating through college, just being a terrible student, and just I had a 2.4 GPA going into my junior year
Really?
of college, yeah, and I realized at that point like. You can't do anything with a bachelor's in psychology. And I needed to figure something out if I wanted to actually make a living. And so I busted my behind. I was able to pull it up to above a 3, but it still wasn't that competitive. So I applied to a bunch of grad programs, and one program accepted me. And it was a master's program. I got into it. And then I realized like this is what I like doing. Like it was extremely difficult. I felt stimulated, and so I really invested my effort and time into it. And then the stars kind of aligned. So the doctoral program had an opening, and they knew that I was going to apply to it after my 2 years as a master's student. And they asked me if I wanted to apply a year early, and I did. I got in, and then then I was just full force. I'm going to be a psychologist. I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to do research. That was my plan. And one day, a Air Force recruiter comes in and does a presentation with my class, and my pulse was like 120.
Oh,
I
really?
was
Yeah.
excited. I did not know this was a thing, and so I was going to go Air Force. And there was a Army psychologist who had come from my program who was coming back to defend his dissertation. He'd been in for like a year. He still had to come back and defend it. And he sent an email out and said, is anybody interested in hearing about Army psychology? And I replied and said, yeah, I would. I was the only one that took him up on that offer. We met at a Starbucks, and the first thing he said to me was, he said, I understand you're interested in the Air Force. I'm going to talk you out of the Air Force into the Army. And his name is Matt Gelker, and he succeeded. He told me about all the opportunities in the Army, but one of the things that caught my attention was operational psychology,
Yeah.
which only exists in the special operations community, and it's what I mentioned earlier. It's that taking elite individuals like yourself and applying psychology to make you better, and which includes selecting people and when they
Yeah.
come in and stuff. And so that got me excited. I applied for the Army, and then I got in, and the rest was history. But that was kind of the route that took. So it was kind of a selfish, lazy route, really.
Uh, again, I don't think that's super unique. That's kind of why a lot of us join the military. We know it's a guaranteed paycheck route. We have job security, and especially people who go to the 75th. There's a little bit of selfishness, I think, in there. You want to go there and be part of the best and do the best and get paid the best. So I'm sure glad that they talked you out of going to the Air Force and coming to the Army. So when you got into the Army, what does the career path for somebody who's a psychologist student or studying a PhD or looking for maybe even a career change that's got a psychology background? What does that career path in the military for psychologists look like?
Yeah, it's a little bit complex. So I'll walk you through. The first piece of it is the internship. So in order to get a doctorate in clinical or counseling psychology, which are really the main two MOSs for psychologists in the Army, or actually it's a single MOS, but
Right.
a clinical psychology background and a counseling psychology background are pretty much the same these days. So, but there's different programs. But so in order to complete your doctorate in one of those fields, you have to do a year-long internship at the end of your education. So it's usually 4 years of coursework. That fifth year, you're operating as a psychologist under the supervision of other psychologists, essentially.
Okay.
That process is extremely competitive. When I went through, they had half of the positions of applicants. So 50% of people that applied did not match with an internship, which meant they had to wait for the next year before they could reapply. And if they didn't get it the second time, they weren't getting their degree.
Right.
And so it was kind of a scary process.
And this is before even the military, right?
Yep.
This is pre.
Yep.
Okay.
So the military offers internships,
Okay.
and they're less competitive because not a lot of people either can or want to sign a contract, a 3-year contract or whatever to join. And so so that's the first step is you have to do an internship, with the Army, and it's that year-long internship where you're practicing, you're seeing soldiers for therapy, you're doing chapter evaluations, you're doing command-directed evaluations, all the stuff that behavioral health does. Right. The Army also offers a postdoctoral residency, which is just another year under training.
Okay.
And when I went through, they had this program that was an operational psychology residency. It doesn't exist anymore, but I applied and got into that. That was at Fort Bragg then, now Fort Liberty, and so that was a year of training me to do operational psychology, and then I went to be that was when I went to regiment to be the regimental psych. So most psychologists in the Army, they come through that way. They do their internship, they do their residency, and then they go out and they become a BHO, behavioral health officer somewhere. And so they'll get attached to a brigade, and they'll be the psychology expert for the brigade commander. Okay. They'll do therapy. There's some other routes too, though. Like some people go into operational psychology, like I did, and they go to one of the special operations units, and they'll do a lot of the operational organizational psych stuff. And then some people even take a more traditional military kind of admin route, where maybe they'll be like a commander.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe they'll be like the USAREC site that advises them. And so there's a couple of different routes. Yeah. And one last thing with that, some people direct commission. Yeah. And so they already do their internship on the outside. They get their degree. Maybe they practice for a few years, and then they come in and join. and direct commission and go immediately into, a position.
Yeah. And like I said, a lot of these topics we have here, we could probably have a whole podcast dedicated
Sure.
to them.
Yeah.
But I want to just ask a question about that. So when you did the internship route. Are you Lieutenant Noble through that
Captain.
time?
Go straight in as a captain.
Did you come in and do Bullock or anything before you started the internship stuff? Okay.
Yep. So we come in and immediately go to Bullock. I was you'd be embarrassed as a Ranger NCO, seeing young Captain Noble. You would be embarrassed for me. I have a vivid memory where when we got sworn in, it was at my internship site at JBLM, and so a couple of us. We were in civilian clothes, and then we were going to change into our uniforms. And that was the first time I ever wore my uniform.
Oh, okay.
And so I go to the bathroom, I put my uniform on, I come out, and I'm like, I'm looking pretty good. And one of the faculty members nudges. You remember now Colonel Simonet,
Oh,
Sierra.
yes.
Sierra's West Pointer, and
Yes.
Sierra's squared away.
Yeah.
One of the faculty members nudges her and says, "Hey, can you fix him?" Talking about me. I had my laces out.
Oh,
I
right.
had, I think the top of my blouse was open. Like it was not good. That was pre-Bullock.
Okay.
And then they sent us to Bullock, and so we can kind of learn all that stuff.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Okay, so you do your internship, and you went straight into the SOF community right after all the internship stuff.
Yeah.
How did that work for you? Were you recruited by SOF to come in? It was a choice. Is that still available to do that?
So the residency is not available anymore. It had some issues, and so it's gone now. That's still an opportunity for folks. They can come in straight out of residency or internship to into the SOF community if they're recruited. But really, what SOF does is that they look for talent and they pull in people that they think would be a good fit. So. Again, like most of my career I've just been lucky, like the stars have aligned for me and I was in the right place at the right time. When I was a resident, we had to do these oral exams. And so it was at the very beginning of the year, and they wanted to take like a baseline measurement of our competence in psychology. And so what they did was they gave us like a packet of a case. So a write-up of somebody who was coming in for therapy with psychological testing and all this stuff. And so we had an hour to review everything. And then we went and sat at a conference table with a bunch of faculty members, and they just grilled us for, an hour just to establish like how competent are we right now. And then they want to do it again at the end to see if their training has had an effect. And Art Finch was on that panel. And so I did my thing. And at the end, he came up to me and he was like, "Hey," he's like, "what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "I got no idea, sir." And he said, "I think you make a good Ranger psych." And like I said at the beginning, I didn't know what he meant. And so he told me a little bit about his experience, and it sounded awesome. It sounded like that's what I wanted to do, and so connected me with Xavier, and then the rest is history. I went to RASP and then joined.
So you go to RASP and get selected for the 75th. What was that experience like a little bit? And then when you got to the 75th, what expectations were met? What were exceeded? What was your initial thoughts of becoming the 75th psych?
Yeah. So going to RASP was a culture shock for me. Before then, I'm doing PT with hospital folks, and nothing against hospital folks, but it's different, right?
Right. Yeah.
I remember on our 2-mile, Army APFT runs, I was like in the lead pack with the hospital. And I remember on the 5-mile run at the RFT, I was literally dead last. I'm in the back. You've got all these high-speed lieutenants just taking off. Yeah. And so, I mean, all of RASP 2 was like that. I remember, we have the FTX, and that FTX, I mean, you've been through it. Yeah. That's brutal, carrying the litter and everything. And I just could not carry that litter. Like I don't know what it was. And so what my squad decided to do was we had rifles and everything and had backpacks. And so they just stuffed a bunch of rifles and backpacks, gave me that and gave me some ammo cans, and I was good. Yeah. And I remember we got on the bus and I was just destroyed. And I remember one of the lieutenants, real nice guy, I can't remember his name, but I remember him saying that. He's like, "Some guys are just built to carry that litter. They could just go for days." Doc is not one of those guys. So yeah, so I squeaked through RASP.
Yeah.
I had a great, I mean, there's phenomenal guys in there who that was my first introduction to the caliber of people that were at Ranger Regiment.
Right.
I remember in my board, I was not nervous about the board because I'm a psych. I talk for a living, you know,
Right,
like I
yeah.
felt like I would be okay. And I noticed that all the other like lieutenants and captains and stuff were very nervous about the board. And I found out real quick why. I remember getting in that board, and Colonel Goldner, Tom Goldner was the board president. I love Colonel Goldner. And he, well, at the beginning of the board, a subject matter expert asks you a question if you're a low density MOS like me. And Xavier Pena was the psych on the board. So he asked me some psych specific questions. And one of the first questions he asked was a very nuanced and good question, but I was excited because I knew the answer to it. And so I made the mistake of saying, "Sir, that's a great question." And Colonel Goldner stops and he points at me. He goes, "Hey, we don't need your validation on what's a good question or not." He said, "Don't forget, you're in a formal board. I expect you to maintain bearing." And so, so that was definitely a shock. But I mean, I understood. I understood what the process was like. And so fast forward, I get to regiment, and I think the thing that really jumped out at me more than anything else was I've never been anywhere else where there was such a strong or large concentration of just incredible people.
Right.
The unquenchable thirst to just be better it is woven into the culture of regiment. It is everywhere. I mean, there's tons and tons of examples of this, but it really is a place where the old adage that a rising tide raises all ships, it runs true. I mean, I just got back. I told you I just got back yesterday from field grade RASP out at Leavenworth, and I sat through 3 days of boards, and it's been about 3 years, I think, since I've supported that. And I left the week wanting to be a better person,
Right.
because it's just that level of
Yeah.
that caliber of individual. It's
Yeah.
just, it's an incredible place with incredible people. And, so much so that I joke and say the regiment was the girl that ruined me for all other girls.
Right.
When I went to my next unit, it paled in comparison.
Right.
And so I kind of lost my fulfillment, in the job. And that was one of the reasons that I decided that I wanted to leave.
Yeah.
But I mean, regiment was that great.
Yeah. So with how many years did you spend at the regiment?
About 5.5.
So in your 5.5 years, aside, I have the same sentiment. The people, every person there, every day I walked into work, I was, I knew I had to earn it every day,
Yeah.
right? Because somebody else was coming. And that was kind of, you had a different peer group. When you got to know some of the lower enlisted guys in the regiment and see them work and operate, what were some of the things that just surprised you the most about like that E5 and below population in the regiment?
Yeah. Yeah, that how do we get to yes kind of mentality. That's what always struck me, is that they were hard charging, but it was always like anytime I would ask them for something, or if I ever had to interact with someone, maybe it was with coordinating stuff for RASP or anything like that, where I interacted with them in that sort of with that kind of relationship. It was this, like it was absolutely, "Sir, like, how can I get it to you?" It was that it was always that, how do we get to yes, that I didn't see in other places. Like when I went to my next unit, there were barriers all over the place, and it felt like people. I don't want to talk bad about the next unit that I went to, but it I almost got the sense in some places that when I would ask for something, or I would make a request, or I had like this innovative idea that I thought could make the organization better, if somebody didn't know how to do it, they were just like, "Oh, sorry, we can't do it."
Yeah.
Whereas regiment, that was not the case. Regiment, the junior enlisted are like, how do we figure this out?
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest thing. And just that hunger, that hunger to grow and be successul and kind of climb up the ladder. Those are the two things that stood out to me.
And so to go to the off script here for the first time, I would love your thoughts on this. Right, I had this. I think everybody has the same epiphany when they leave the regiment to leave to go to the civilian world, or they leave to go to another unit. That there's just like this hole there.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
people are just not the same. You can't find that same culture that you found in the regiment. It's just, and you, when you're in it, you don't realize how special it is
Yeah.
until you get out. For those that are out there that are listening, because I talked to a lot of guys that are either retired or got out, and they're still trying to fill that hole, right?
Yeah.
Understand what advice would you give them about finding happiness in their next career, their next job, or understanding that it's not everywhere is going to be like the regiment? It's a hard question, I'm sure, to answer, but what would you say?
Yeah. So for me, there's some research that looks at like basic psychological needs for humans to make them happy, right? These researchers, Ryan and Deci, the guys, they created this thing called self-determination theory, and this is where they talk about this. But they say people need three things in their life to be fulfilled. They need autonomy, which is like nobody likes to be told what to do, right? Like when like you can Google people disobeying signs and see great examples of people they just don't like being told what to do.
That's true.
But the other two, I think, are more relevant for people getting out of places like a regiment. One is mastery. It's getting better at something, developing at something, having some kind of goal to go after. Rangers are goal-oriented creatures, and so when you're in regiment, those goals are clear. It's it starts with RASP, and then Ranger School, and then I want to be a team leader, squad leader. It's climbing up that ladder. When you get out, you have to create your own goals. Whatever you're pursuing, you have to figure out what that is, and it's not set out for you. And so being able to achieve that mastery or that competence in something, I think, is incredibly important. And I always say this, I've done a few speaking engagements the last year, and one of the things that I always talk about is if you're not living your life in accordance with what you value, then it's a recipe for depression. If you're, a lot of people have heard the term cognitive dissonance. It's this idea that if your behaviors and your beliefs don't match, they clash. That's the dissonance, right? If somebody values like being a leader or helping others or being a good spouse, but their behaviors are not aligned with that, they're gonna feel that cognitive dissonance, and they're gonna experience that inner turmoil. And so being able to define what your values are and then look at your schedule and make sure that you're implementing behaviors that are consistent with those values, that's huge to me. And I think the regiment does a lot of that for us, or did a lot of that for us. And so you have to do that yourself when you get out. So autonomy, mastery. The third one is probably the most important, and that it's called relatedness, and that's being a part of a group. Right. When you're in regiment, man, you are inundated with the culture of regiment. Like you've got the Ranger Creed memorized. Yeah. One of my favorite things, by the way, is just sidebar, was when I'm doing PT in the mornings and I hear the RASP 1 class reciting the Ranger Creed in the mornings, and it's echoing across Fort Benning or Fort Moore. Yeah. It would give me chills. It made me stand a little taller every day. So, I hear you. Yep. But that relatedness is huge. I mean, we, as I mentioned earlier, we as human beings, like we have to attach ourselves with a group, and that's how we're wired. Yeah. And in regiment, I mean, you're part of a prestigious group with a very, very clear culture. Yeah. And when you get out, you may have an identity crisis. You may feel like who am I? Yeah. I mean, I was only in there for 5.5 years as an officer. I didn't have to go through the trials and tribulations that you did, as an enlisted. And even I felt that when I left. I felt like, man, who am I? Or, because I don't have a scroll on my sleeve anymore. And so, again, long-winded way to say that you got to be deliberate with keeping in touch with the community. Yeah. There's lots of venues for that. The Three Ranger Foundation has their mentorship program. I highly encourage anybody to stay a part of that. Before we talked about like Carl Munger, and the Gallant Few, and I mentioned to you that Tim Spalla, is standing up this like Ranger resilience kind of program. Like getting involved with anything like that you can. I think is huge, because a lot of Rangers are introverted too. And
yes.
and I'm the same way. And so my default is to just, I'm just going to do my own thing. Yeah. When I really know that being a part of a group of like-minded people is
Yeah.
good for me.
Yeah, I know from my own personal experiences, I'm the same way. I'll do my own thing, and I'll do my own thing and be on an island, as I say, for 60 days, 90 days. But that wears me out mentally
Mm-hmm.
and emotionally. And I usually have to get to some sort of breaking point. And what do I do? What gets me out of it is I reach out to a ranger buddy,
Yeah.
like somebody I knew, and I talk to him. And we are terrible about staying connected when we leave service.
Yeah.
I don't know why we're so bad at it, right? I think there's a lot of reasons why we don't want to feel like a burden. We don't
Yep.
want to ask for help.
Yep.
We're out of shape anymore. We don't hold the standard anymore, so we feel like we're going to be judged for it.
Yeah.
I think those are all things, and they're all things that I've heard people say, but super important. And you answered about 3 of the next questions there, but I want to ask is, so you transitioned out
Mm-hmm.
of service. What led you to transition out?
Yeah.
And what did you learn in that transition, or any advice you'd give to somebody that's sitting there, thinking about or about to transition into the next phase of their life after uniform?
Yeah. Yeah. In the name of vulnerability, I'll self-disclose a little bit. So I loved my job at Regiment. Best job I've ever had. And my predecessor, Xavier Pena, he said something to me that resonated when he recruited me. He said, "This is the best job I've ever had, and I know it's the best job I'm ever going to have."
Yeah.
And that has rang true. It was an amazing position. So I left Regiment. Or let me back up. In Regiment, I invested every bit of energy I had at the expense of relationships in my life. I was gone. I was TDY 60% of the time. I'd go to Afghanistan twice a year for short stints, but it revolved around like our partner force assessment selection and stuff and other things. And so I'm gone all the time. Was married at the time, and so the wife was just completely burned out. Right. She and one of the downsides of being somewhere for longer than for 5 years rather than like the 2 or 3 years that most officers do, is that she really put some roots down in her job. She loved her job where she was. She's working up in Atlanta, and so we had a conversation, and she said, "Look," she's like, "I don't want to do this anymore in terms of the military lifestyle." And she wanted me to get out, and I initially agreed to get out, and so I'm like trying to figure out how to navigate civilian life, and I ran into a couple of obstacles, and I just kind of got discouraged because I had some opportunities. I was talking with some different USASOC units, one in the Fort Bragg area and one in DC, and one day I just remember getting angry and saying, "You know what? I've got these opportunities. I want to stay in." And I remember telling her, and I said, I'm going to apply to this unit in DC, and I'd like you to come with me. And she said, "Nope."
Oh yeah. Wow.
And so that was the start of the divorce. And so this was 2020, right at the beginning of COVID. Had to put a dog down like the week after. And
you're a dog lover.
Oh man! Oh, I mean, my dog's paw print is tattooed on my arm. So, and that was awful,
right.
Awful. I don't have kids, and so
right.
I treat my pups like kids,
right.
And oh man, that the grief from that was awful. Another sidebar here. One of the things that is really amazing about Regiment is again the people. It was during COVID, and so the vets were not letting you come inside.
Oh,
and so I was going to have to drop my dog off to the vet in the parking lot and say goodbye there. And the regimental vet called him, and he and his tech, they drove the hour up the road to LaGrange and put the dog down,
oh, yeah.
In our bed. So yep. Which was that meant the world to me.
Yep.
So all this is going down in 2020. Wife moves out. And then I'm still there for another year, and right. So I'm alone in my house, and so I PCS eventually, and I get to my next unit, and it wasn't Regiment.
Right.
I'm up there alone for the first time. I've got my other dog, and then trying to figure out how to navigate that, and so I had a lot of life stressors and everything going on, and but I just did not feel that level of professional fulfillment that I felt before, right. And I had put everything in the career at the expense of my personal life. And so I told myself I'd give it a year. If I still felt this way in a year, then I'm going to look elsewhere. And a year goes by and I still felt the same way. And so then I decided, I think I'm thinking about getting out. I didn't want to leave my boss high and dry because he would have to cover down on my position. And I remember having a conversation with him. We were in a Firehouse Subs. I remember him. I remember telling him that, yeah, I think I just want to leave. I said, but I'll wait. I'll wait until 6 months. That way you can get a replacement and all this. And he said, have you ever heard of the poem, "The Indispensable Man"? And I said no, and I can't quote it from memory, right? But the gist of the poem is that if you ever want to see the impact that the indispensable man makes when he leaves an organization, take a bucket of and fill it up with water, put your hand in the bucket, and then remove your hand and see what impact your removal of your hand makes. And basically that nobody's indispensable, and that was a number one. That's an awesome leader who said that to me. He put my well-being over his in the organization. But he said, I think if you feel in this way and you want to get out, do it now. Yeah. And so that was kind of the push. And then so that was my psychology boss. My unit commander also had similar sentiments. And so both of those guys really sort of gave me the permission to do it. And and so and here I am.
Yeah. You bring up an interesting thing there with this separating from your spouse. When you're in the Ranger Regiment or other soft units where you have stability for a long time, I think a lot of people think that, I heard it all the time from conventional, like, oh, that's awesome. You didn't have to PCS as much and do things, which is great, but there is a cost to that. Because eventually all things come to an end, and especially in the soft community, you're going to have to go at some point. And when you have roots down, or your spouse does, or your kids do, it is that much harder, depending on how deep those roots are, to pull it all up and move. And it can be, catastrophic to relationships with kids and spouses and stuff, which I think sometimes we just don't really think about it that way. So in all your time in the service, there's the stigma around mental health, right? I had the stigma. I preached the stigma.
Yeah,
right?
You avoided me apparently, right?
I was part of the problem for years. And how do we work? I think it's getting better, right? It seemed to be getting better when I was leaving the organization, but from your point of view, is it better than when you first came to regiment and you left? Is that stigma gone down a little bit, where some of these, we would go and seek your advice and help and so forth? We're such stubborn individuals. It's not just you guys. We have strength and conditioning coaches that we don't use because we know better on our own, right? As Rangers, we know better than everybody else. So what is your thought on just the stigma around mental health in the military and where we're at?
Yeah. That's a difficult question. I'll tell you, one of the things that I noticed at Regiment that I really appreciated was when the fact that I was embedded in the organization and I was part of more things than just behavioral health, I think was huge. Right. I was involved in the RAS process. So every senior NCO and every officer that came through the organization, they would have to sit down with one of us to get into the gate, right? But we would do feedback with them afterwards, where we would give them like feedback on their personality test and everything. And I would always have this conversation with them that, hey, my assessment selection hat was on the last time we met. Now, like you're in the gate, you've made it. Now my role is to make you better. Right. And so trying to set that message right off the bat, that like my role is not to try to send you home, right, or kick you out of the regiment or whatever. Like, now you're here. I want to make you better. Right. And so I found that initial contact made a big difference in terms of people's receptiveness to come and seek me, later. So there was that. And I mean, I loved regiment, so I wanted to be involved with everything. And, I'd go out to the FTX for RAS2 and walk, the however many miles that is with the cadre and talk with them. And, and so being embedded, I feel like that was probably the best thing that I could have done, because I can't tell you how many times Rangers would hit me up and say, hey, Doc, I'm struggling with this. What do you think? What's your recommendation? Or what I really appreciated was when Rangers had a Ranger buddy who was struggling, and they would call me and say, hey, I got this guy who's struggling. Like, he's nervous to come in, but like, how can we get him in there? Yeah. The fact that they had that trust in me and my shop, I thought that was huge.
Yeah.
I mean, there's things that regiment does that creates that sort of trust and embeddedness, and I think it has a lot to do with the operational psychology kind of nature, where I'm involved with more than just clinical stuff.
Right.
But there's also something as simple as removing barriers to get to me,
Right.
and like Skype. Like we had our computer systems, we had Skype. Anybody in the regiment could type in my name and then shoot me a direct message.
Right.
And that happened numerous times. I'd be sitting in RAS boards and somebody would message me and say, "Hey, can I meet with you, today or tomorrow or whatever?" And so, I don't know if I have a good response to your question, other than what I saw when I was there was the more that I could be embedded in the unit. And I think it helps that everybody at regiment has to go through the same selection process. Right. Everybody wears a tan beret. Yeah. Everybody is a ranger. And so I think that helped right off the bat with trust. And then also, if a psychologist is doing their job, right at the very beginning when they meet with you, they tell you exactly like what information is going to stay confidential. If ever there's a med board that's going to happen or whatever, it's never going to be a surprise to you. Right. Like it will be an ongoing discussion. And so like I took every opportunity I had to dispel rumors and stuff that if you went and saw the psych and you like shared that you're depressed, that boom, you're out of the Army. That's not how it happens. No. Yeah. And so, so I mean, I think it's really just the embedded piece, and then also proper education, I think is the way forward.
Yeah. And then, but with that is a cost. There's only so many of you and so many people in your shop. And I know you probably ran into problems with just being able to manage organization of our size with the people that you had. I wish, is it because it's hard to hire people to come in there, or is it because what was the reason it was sometimes so hard? There's just a lot of Rangers and a very few of you. That seems to be the problem sometimes that we run into.
Yeah. Manning issues were the biggest issues that I dealt with when I was there, and they still deal with it. So I got a couple of thoughts around that. One is it's hard to get active duty psychs to be able to pass Ranger standards. Yeah. That's like the biggest thing. We would pull people from residencies where we could, and then we ran into some bureaucratic issues with psychological consultant at the time, and that's a whole nother story. But but there was always barriers to recruiting folks, and then we'd bring people out to RASP, and then they'd fail the RFT, and so that was always an issue. So finding somebody who is physically fit and competent and not a weirdo was tough. Right. Because I don't know if you noticed, but sometimes psychologists can be kind of weird.
100%.
Yeah. So on the active duty side, that was always difficult. And on the civilian side, location was pretty tough too. Not a lot of people want to live in Columbus, Georgia. Right. I don't know why. Yeah. But so it was hard to find somebody who would want to stay, and then you just deal with the Manning issues that everybody has to deal with in terms of like some people are just not good fits, or some psychologists have their own issues that cause them to not want to stick around or whatever. But man, that was the biggest issue. And I was talking to the current regimental psych this week, and it's still an issue. They're still struggling with Manning.
Yeah, I noticed that if you look across psychology outside of the military, and I look at sports teams a lot, they've incorporated psychology big time into athletics, right? Professional sports teams, high profile universities, they have sports psychologists, and they're in there and they're embedded, and it's a help. I wish we could do that more for the military, and having people in there now. But on the reverse side, I'm a huge advocate for going and talking to mental health professionals, even though I wasn't for about 18 years, right? I avoided it like the plague. But what I do tell people, and I'd like your perspective, is, hey, when you go and you talk to a mental health provider, if you don't click with them, you got to interview this provider.
Yes.
Like if you're not going to be able to be comfortable with them and open up with them, it's a waste of your time, and it's a waste of, the provider's time.
Yep.
I'm right in telling them that, right?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It's probably a poor comparison, but I kind of compare it to dating. Yeah. Like you need to be able to click with the other person. The thing, when you look at the research, the thing that really makes therapy effective the most is that therapeutic relationship you have with that other person. The fact that you feel like they have this unconditional positive regard for you, and they feel like you can trust them, and that they're accepting of you. And really, I mean, therapy at the end of the day, really what therapy is you've got like a co-pilot to kind of help you get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
It's not somebody who's telling you what to do and giving you advice or whatever. It's your protected time weekly or however often you go, where you can work on yourself. The therapist has like tools and techniques and stuff they can bring to the table, but you need somebody that's gonna match with you. And so you're absolutely right with that. I think that's important, because too many times people go, like, they finally muster up the courage to go. They sit down with somebody, and the person, they just don't click. And then the person's like, oh, I'm done. Therapy's not for me. It's not. That's not it. And you gotta try. Get back out in the dating world. Like, you gotta try it, at least another couple of people.
Yeah, I was gonna compare it to like dealing with dirty car salesmen. Like, you're not gonna, but I don't want to. That didn't feel right with sitting in the room. But just because you had a bad experience with one salesman doesn't mean you're still not in the market for that vehicle or
Absolutely.
whatever. You got to go somewhere else and find somebody. And it took me a long time. I talked to you, right, on a professional, professionally. I've talked to other people in the RSAC shop. It took a while for me to realize I can't talk to a man. I just can't do it.
Yeah.
I had to realize that I needed to talk to a female to really open up and be honest. And, there's a whole rabbit hole that we could go down on that, but it's just, don't give up is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If you're out there, you're struggling, and there's something inside of yourself, I think, if you need to talk, right? Yeah. You have that feeling. If you're out there, you're having that feeling, don't give up. Go find the right person. I promise that they're out there. I want to talk a little bit about a nasty 4-letter acronym, right? PTSD.
Yeah.
And what is PTSD? Why are we so scared to say it, be associated with it? I think there's stigma that comes along with just psychology in general, and seeing somebody, and there's another layer of it when you start saying PTSD.
Yeah.
And PTSD immediately to a lot of people from our profession means I'm losing my clearance, I'm losing my job.
Yeah.
Right, wrong, or indifferent. That's just the way it's thought of, and it's still thought of that way. So when I say PTSD, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. PTSD is the body doing what it's designed to do, essentially, but to the point where it interferes with your ability to function. And so I'll give you an example of that. Let's say that that someone's driving to work, and they stop at a gas station to pump gas. So they're pumping gas in their car, and all of a sudden they feel the cold steel of a gun barrel at the back of their head, and someone's carjacking them. So that's a traumatic event. So that's the first criteria for PTSD, is there has to be a traumatic event where your life was threatened, or you witnessed someone else's life threatened, or there's some kind of risk to your physical integrity. And what I mean by that is like sexual assault can result in PTSD. So there's a traumatic event. So this person, let's say this person, gets away that like unscathed, and so they get their car back. A week later, they're driving back to work. They've got to stop and get gas. That same gas station's there, and all of a sudden they're feeling this increase in blood pressure and heart rate, and they're sweating, and that's fight or flight. Their body knows that last time they were at that gas station, they almost died. Yeah. And so their body has taken everything around that gas station, the smell of gas, what things look like, how it feels, whatever, all the senses, and they filed that away in this file that's labeled danger. Yeah. And so the natural instinct is to avoid. Mm-hmm. And so let's say that person says, I'm gonna get gas on the way home, and so they avoid it. Avoiding that stimulus now has trained them that if they can avoid, then they don't have to feel the anxiety. So let's say they go to work, they're coming home, and they're like, I need to get gas. And they still are like, no, I'm going to wait. I'm just going to do it tomorrow. I've got, 30 miles left or whatever. When the person cannot go to work because they can't put gas in their car, that's when it becomes PTSD. That's when it is a disorder because it's interfering with their ability to function occupationally. Now, there's all kinds of versions like flavors based on that scenario where, maybe it's causing problems with somebody at home. Maybe they're like super irritable because they're experiencing all of this angst related to their history of trauma, But the key is that it creates functional impairment for them for it to be PTSD.
Right.
PTS is where you've got symptoms, but it's not creating any kind of problems for you. And lots of people with combat experience PTS, but they're able to implement the protective strategies and stuff. They're seeking treatment or whatever that keeps it from interfering with their life. So it's not technically PTSD.
Right.
So the way to treat that individual that is avoiding the gas stations would be to make them go to the gas station.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exposure, right?
Yeah.
Because what happens is that person has created an association between the gas station and danger.
Yeah.
And so the way we break associations is you have to expose yourself to those things like the gas station, and there not be danger. And you got to do it over and over and over again until that association breaks. I gave this example with a group a few weeks ago, and I always ask the class, like the audience, I said, if you were a psychologist for a day, how would you treat this? And like, what would you do to help the person? And a guy raised his hand and said, just get him an electric car. I'm like, well, that completely, ruined my my story here. But yeah, so exposures is how you treat it. And there's some treatments that are exposure based, and they have been shown to be incredibly effective at treating PTSD. So there's something called prolonged exposure therapy, which is where if you have that traumatic event that you don't want to think about, you're talking through it like you're still there over and over and over again in the therapy session.
Yeah.
Outside of the room, you're exposing yourself to things in a very structured manner, but you're exposing yourself to things that you would normally avoid.
Right.
And you don't do it all at once. Like the gas station example guy wouldn't, like the therapist wouldn't make him go to the same gas station and pump gas like right off the bat. The first step would be like you maybe go to a different gas station and just sit there and don't pump gas. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you get a friend to go with you or whatever. Like you work your way up the hierarchy until you're able to do that thing again. Yeah. So that's prolonged exposure therapy. I will say there's another kind of version of PTSD where it's a lot of people it's referred to now as like moral injury. Yeah. And so that is where you've done something that you feel like goes against your moral character. And so it's like an injury to your conscience. Right. That one, there's something called cognitive processing therapy, where it's really more of kind of talking through your interpretation of the event. There's still an element of exposure, but that one's, reserved for a situation more like that. But there's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy, which is just another form of exposure therapy. There's written exposure therapy where you're writing out the stuff instead. But the bottom line is that the research is very clear. Like PTSD is treatable. Right. You just have to be willing to go through the treatment. And if you wanted to do it, you wouldn't need to do it. Right. I mean, it is difficult treatment, but
very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can speak from, I'll speak from my own experiences doing prolonged exposure and doing some of that stuff. And I think, and maybe you can elaborate on it a little bit, is what surprised me the most when I went down my mental health journey is I wanted to talk about the Army and the things I went through, but who the provider I went through said, we got to go back farther than that. We got to talk about the childhood first. And I, I went through some trauma as a child, through saw some things that most 5-year-old kids shouldn't see. But I was surprised at how, they're like, that stuff can tie into some of the things you did in combat and make it worse. And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, stress and trauma can be cumulative, and you think about, so going back to the beginning of our talk, I talked about how some people feel like they're not good enough.
Yeah.
That's a core belief, and that's developed early on. Core beliefs are what you believe about yourself and what you believe about the world. And some people, based on early experiences, they develop a core belief that the world is a dangerous place and I must protect myself at all times. Yeah. And so they go through life, that early trauma creates that. Then they go through life and they have more trauma, which just solidifies the belief. And so then it results in them putting in compensatory mechanisms to where they're protecting themselves more, but maybe that's them isolating themselves, or maybe that's them doing things that are not necessarily healthy for them, but it keeps them safe in their mind. Right. And so your therapist, your provider was good that they went back, to early trauma.
Yeah. And like you said, it's not going to be easy. Right. It's kind of like going to the regiment or a soft, like you're going to have to put in work. You have to do things that are uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, I feel like a better person. I felt like a new person coming out of therapy, and I still go back to it. But and I will say on the other side, the VA side, it is difficult again, reconnecting and doing that, and that's a whole nother topic. And hopefully we can fix that for some of our veterans out there that are struggling. But as we bring it in, we start to kind of land the plane here. If somebody's out there is listening and they're considering a career field similar to what you had in the military psychology and stuff, what traits do you think that person should have? What would make them successful? Why should they do it? Why shouldn't they do it?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to keep my theme of being long-winded with
Oh,
your
you're
questions.
fine.
So,
Keep it.
it's funny. One of my regrets at Regiment is back when I was trying to find psychs, active duty psychs, and I couldn't find anybody. I thought, man, wouldn't it be cool if I could get a bunch of Rangers who are getting out to get their degrees and then come back, and then I have like this big pool of Ranger tabbed, psychologists that could be operational psychologists. And I never did it. I never went and talked to them, which again, like it would have been a 5 or 6 year investment,
Yeah.
but that was like 6 years ago. Like it, you know, so the traits that I think would make somebody a good fit for this field, it depends on what route they want to go down, because there's different roads for this field. If you are a caring and compassionate individual and you get a lot of fulfillment out of helping somebody, then I think the therapy road to being a therapist is kind of the way to go. And you don't have to be a psychologist. You can get your master's degree and do that. So there's 2-year programs where you could do like a counseling, like a master's in counseling psychology, where after 2 years you're out practicing, you're seeing people. There's like marriage and family degrees. There's social work degrees. There's three different routes where somebody can do it on the master's level. If you're somebody who you like kind of like problem solving and investigating, that's where the psychologist kind of comes into play. So the thing that sets the psychologist apart from other folks is a psychologist is an expert on assessment. So I have tools, I have like psychological tests and stuff at my disposal that'll help me really do a deep dive into somebody's personality and understand kind of who they are. And there's lots of jobs in the field that allow you to do that. Like there's people who are forensic psychologists that they determine somebody's competence to stand trial. That stuff is a little more on the investigative kind of side and less more of like helping people. And then if you want to work with the military population, if you want to do like operational psychology in the Army, what you would have to do is you'd have to get a doctorate in counseling or clinical psychology. You'd have to do your internship and practice clinically first, and then get invited into the SOF community. And really, with operational psychology, there's the personnel selection piece, like RASP. There's doing like program improvement research, which is one of my favorite things, where maybe the command has a question of, how do we select better Rangers or something. You might have remembered a survey that I sent out when I was there where I asked leaders to rank order their subordinates and tell me who they would hire and who they wouldn't again. Mm-hmm. And so, we took that information and then took all our psych testing from RASP and then tried to predict like who's the most successful, what traits make a successful Ranger. And that stuff's really fun for me.
Right. Yeah.
And so operational psychology really allowed me to kind of scratch that itch. And then I'm also somebody who I get bored easily and I need like to be stimulated. And so deploying was awesome. Yeah. And I just had a thought too related to deployment. One of the most fulfilling things that I would ever do, or one of the moments where I felt most fulfilled at Regiment, was when I would deploy and we'd be at Bath. And you remember in the JOC, the second floor, yeah. I would go up to the second floor and I would look down at everybody. And you were down there at one time.
Oh, yeah. I spent some time down there for sure.
Yeah. And looking at all of these individuals who I helped select or develop, man, you talk about fulfillment.
Right.
Seeing you guys in action, seeing you guys doing your job and just crush it. It always warmed my heart, doing that. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure I didn't answer your question, but
I think you did. I think you did for sure. So the last question I ask everybody, right? If you could go back and talk to that captain that had his boots all jacked up and his uniform all messed up, and you knowing what you know now, what advice would you give him when he's embarking on his military career?
Yeah, that's probably the most difficult question that you've asked me this whole time, because I think I'm still trying to figure out kind of my purpose,
Right.
in life. I think the biggest thing that I would tell myself is knowing what I know now is that you are incredibly task oriented, and you really need to balance that with being relationship oriented.
Yeah.
I have some choices that I've made in the past that I'm regretful of because I chose career and achievement
Yeah.
over being there for like friends and family and stuff. And so that was, there were many reasons why I got out of the Army. That was one of the big things where I was sort of at this crossroads where I'm like, do I just continue to neglect the relationships and continue to push down this task-focused career path, or do I do opposite from what I normally do, and do I go and focus on family?
Right.
And so I chose the latter, and I wish I would have done that sooner, because at the end of the day, the most important thing in life is the relationships with the folks, with your friends and family and stuff, So if I could go back, I would tell myself, you need to, going back to what I said at the beginning about aligning your values with your behaviors. I wish I would have looked at that, and because I have a lot of values that are relationship based that my behaviors are not matching.
Right.
And so being able to purposely align those behaviors with those values, I think would have been important.
Yeah. Awesome stuff. Maybe someday we can come back and we can deep dive some more of this stuff
Yeah, totally.
at a future podcast. Like you said, I think we could talk for 3 hours on some of this stuff, go full Joe Rogan experience and just go for 4 days. But I appreciate you coming on. And I mean it when I say this. Thanks for your service. Thanks for what you did. Thanks for helping select me a few times as you sat in my boardrooms at RASP and got me through there. And for everybody out there listening, do everything I need you to do. Like, share, subscribe. Somebody needs to hear this episode. It's going to help them out of a bad day or a bad year or a bad month or whatever it is. Thanks again for coming on. And everybody out there, we'll see you on the next episode.